We've been looking at the 7 sayings from Jesus from the cross, and what we've looked at is that there is construct and design behind these 7 sayings, and that it would seem that Jesus was well prepared for what would be his last public witness, and that the cross provided the most unusual opportunity and place for his public performance or his public speaking of his last sermon, and that the 7 sayings are largely built upon the first sermon that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount, and the ideas that come from the Sermon on the Mount are found on all 7 sayings that Jesus uses from the cross. And clearly Jesus didn't know exactly how the events were going to transpire. I'm sure the Father hadn't told him that he was going to find a repentant malefactor that would turn to him from the cross. These were things that Jesus saw happen as they happened, but could see the Father's hand in it immediately, and he chose specific words that he had prepared in his mind for a long time. He was ready for this event. And that's very important when we come to this 4th saying, because the 4th saying from the cross is the most powerful saying from the cross, perhaps along with the first saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We now enter into the 4th saying, where we're looking specifically at Jesus' relationship with his Father. In the first sayings, we've gone from outside and moved slowly closer and closer and closer into this incredible personal relationship that was taking place on the cross. The first saying revolved around people around the cross that were his enemies. As we said at the beginning, it seemed that the woman stood afar off, the disciples had forsaken him and fled, and his words were directed at those that were so far outside the intimate relationships that he had with people, or he had with his Father. They were said to a Roman soldier, to a centurion, to the soldiers that were there, parting his garments and casting lots, and to the Jews. It was a national prayer, like Moses interceded on behalf of the nation, that God would give them space, give them time to repent, that God would relent of the impending judgment as the Father looked down and saw what they were doing to his Son. And Jesus could see, feel the wrath of his Father and prayed, Lord, forgive them. Give them time, just like Moses did, just like Daniel did. And then we see that moving closer, we have a former follower of Jesus. And we looked at the thief on the cross as a former disciple who had turned his back to follow King Barabbas, but then at the last moment turned back again to Jesus. And Jesus said, with me you will be in paradise if you can keep with me. And then, of course, we get ever so close, because we came in the 3rd saying to his closest and most dearest friends and associates in this world, his dear beloved mother and the disciple whom he loved. We don't know what time it was that John moved away from the cross, taking Mary with him. And as those other women would have moved away as well, comforting Mary. And they moved away from the scene of the cross, and darkness descended. It would have probably been sometime just before midday as Mary and John and the other Marys, Salome, moved away. And then all of a sudden, darkness descended on the land. And around the cross there had been taunts and cries and jeers and mocking towards Jesus. But all of a sudden there was a darkness that hadn't been felt for thousands of years. A darkness that descended over the land, a darkness that could be felt, a darkness that reminded every Jew of the day when darkness descended upon the land of Egypt, and the firstborn of every Egyptian died. A darkness which highlighted the death of the firstborn. And there would have been silence, wouldn't there? An eerie silence around the cross as the darkness descended. And there was silence for 3 hours. And it was at the very end of that 3 hours, right at the time of the evening sacrifice, that Jesus commenced the beginning of his last 4 sayings. The last 4 sayings are almost consecutive. They happened one after the other. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. It would have shattered the silence. Everybody there would have felt their hair stand up on the back of their head. Shivers down their spine as they heard this cry from the cross in a loud voice. And then he cried, I thirst. Finished. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. And it was over. In a matter of moments. And this saying, I believe, has direct relationship to Jesus and his Father at that time. It was cried out for those around to hear and understand. It was an answer to the chants that were going on. God's forsaken him, they were crying. That's what they were crying from the cross. What's he doing up there? God's forsaken him. It's strange that if this translation, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, is actually what Jesus said, doesn't it mean that they were right? Wouldn't they have turned around and said, see, even he thinks so. Told you he'd forsaken him. Even he thinks so. It doesn't make any sense that this is what Jesus cried. And so there's been a lot of controversy around the meaning of this verse. And we're using slides this morning. I got special dispensation from James, so just so that you know that. He said he's going to bear all the responsibility for those who might be concerned about the slides, because we have a lot of material we want to cover. And unfortunately, in trying to dig down into what Jesus was saying at this time, we have to dig a little bit into, the original language, and we have to do a little bit of exposition. But I'm hoping that we can try to keep it as simple as possible and try to give you some idea of what Jesus might have said. But in truth, I don't actually know exactly what Jesus said. I think there is confusion around it. What is clear is that this part here, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, has been added by those who struggled to see in the original what these words were actually saying. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And it's built upon the fact that when you come back to Matthew chapter 27, by the way, this saying is only found in Matthew and Mark's record. It's the only saying that is found in Matthew and Mark's record. All the other sayings, 3 sayings found in Luke's gospel, all revolve around Jesus Christ's work as a priest. They all revolve around his sacrificial work. My God, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Verily I say unto thee, with me you'll be in paradise, and into thy hand I commit my spirit. Were all acts of the priesthood, which we're going to look at in our final study. The 3 sayings in John, woman, behold thy son behold thy mother, I thirst, and it is finished. Again, we'll look at those more in the next study, but they all revolve around Jesus' work in judgment and crushing the serpent. This saying, the middle saying on the cross that happened at the end of 3 hours, is the only saying that's found in both Matthew and Mark's gospel. And Matthew and Mark's gospel, of course, is the gospel of the king and the gospel of the servant. And that is enormously significant. This saying is found in the gospel of the king and the gospel of the servant. And when you look at Matthew chapter 27 and verse 46, you'll see the words, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. But it's built on a number of references which are directly cited or referred to back to Psalm 22. Verse 34, they gave him vinegar to drink. That's a direct citation, of course, from Psalm 22. Verse 35, they parted my garments amongst them and cast lots. Psalm 22, verse 18. Verse 39, and as they passed by, they reviled him. Again, direct quotation from Psalm 22. Verse 43, he trusted in God that he would deliver him. Psalm 22, verse 8. So over and over again in this record, things are happening around the cross taken from Psalm 22. So when in the record you have this saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, there are those that are recording this and have struggled to see the meaning behind it, have made an assumption that it's a direct citation from Psalm 22. And what we're going to look at and we're going to see is that whilst Jesus might be alluding to Psalm 22, and I'm sure he is, it is not a quotation from Psalm 22. And it seems to me that, this is one thing that's missed out of most interpretations of this verse. So when Jesus cried, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? There are a number of different suggestions from it. And here are four, going from what I might say probably, to me anyway, the worst suggestions, getting better each time. So Jesus' sacrifice was to appease an angry God. And because he was taking upon him the sins of the world, God could not look upon sin at that time, and so forsook Jesus on the cross. Second one is that at this time Jesus was about to die, and that God had to withdraw his spirit from him at that very last moment. And Jesus suddenly felt the power of God's Spirit being taken from him and reacted to that with this saying. 3, that Jesus is not actually quoting Psalm 22, that he is reciting Psalm 22, that he actually went on to recite the entire psalm, starting from my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And when he got down to verse 15 of Psalm 22, he says, I thirst, my tongue cleaveth to the roof of my mouth. I cannot speak, my tongue is dried up like a potsherd. And they gave him something to drink in order that he could finish it. And the end of Psalm 22 says, he hath done it, is equivalent to it is finished. So that's an alternative suggestion. 4, that he was using typical Jewish teaching, which was to answer a question with a question, a rhetorical response. When Jesus, of course, had the Herodians and the Sadducees come together and they said, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar? He said, show me a penny. Whose image and superscription? Jewish teaching was often to answer a question with a question. So, in that light, they say, why has God forsaken him? Why has God forsaken him? Jesus responds and says, why has God forsaken me? And he answers the question with a question. Now I find that quite a reasonable explanation if Jesus is actually saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So, one of the things that, before we sort of expound this, is we need to understand that this idea of the word forsaken in Psalm 22, the word ozab, is an idea that the Jews knew. It was a teaching concerning their relationship with God, their covenant relationship with God, that they all fully understood. In fact, this word, forsaken, or zab, in Psalm 22 appears over 200 times in the Old Testament. Over 100 of them directly refer to forsaking God or forsaking his covenant, or God's promise that he will never forsake those people who do not forsake his covenant. The Jews fully understood this concept and this word that's used in Psalm 22 as their covenant relationship that God made with them. So when you go through the Old Testament, you'll see it all the time. And here's a couple of quotes. As I said, there's over 100 of them. I've just picked a couple. Be strong and of good courage. Fear not, be not afraid of them. For Yahweh your God is he that doth go with you, and he will not fail you nor forsake you. same word. 1 Samuel 12, verse 20 and 22. Yet turn not aside from following Yahweh, but serve Yahweh with all your heart, for Yahweh will not forsake his people. Again, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 12 and 13, concerning this house which thou art building, as God was talking about the building of the temple and his promise to David, he says, if you keep my statutes and my commandments and perform all these things, then at the end of the verse, I will dwell with my people of Israel, and I will not forsake my people of Israel. And then one of the most famous ones, which we know, Psalm 37, where David says, I am young and now I've been old. One of the last words of David, and this have I seen, I have never, ever seen the righteous forsaken. God will never forsake the righteous. It doesn't happen. In contrast, there's lots of quotes which show that God does forsake the wicked. Of Manasseh, king of Judah, hath done these abominations, and because of this I will forsake them. Isaiah 2, therefore thou hast forsaken the people of the house of Jacob, because they be replenished from the east, and bring in soothsayers like the Philistines. So, that was just a quick brief to show that this is a theme running right through the Old Testament, that God forsakes the wicked, God never forsakes the righteous. We often use a phrase like, well, nothing could have prepared him for that moment. You know, like in literature, you would say that, you know, that idea, nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. And you might think that concerning the cross. But you see, the thing is, Psalm 88 says, from my youth up, I am ready to die. Jesus knew from the very outset, early on in his ministry, what God had planned for him and what it was going to take. He knew he was going to be crucified. He knew the detail of that crucifixion. And one of the things that pained him the most was he knew he was going to be forsaken by his friends. He said to them, all you shall forsake me. He knew that. All, everyone, like sheep, gone astray, would turn their back on him. In fact, he said so. In John chapter 16, verse 32, he knew this. He said, behold, the hour is coming, and now is, that you will be scattered, every man to his own, and shall leave me alone. Yet I am not alone. I will not be alone, because the Father is with me. So how was Jesus going to be able to endure such a trial? Psalm 80, of course, talks about the Son of my right hand, whom I have made strong for myself, the branch whom I have made strong. Morning by morning, he wakened him, prepared him for this. When Jesus was in the garden, the full enormity of these events came upon Jesus. The battle was lost in the garden in Genesis, where Adam and Eve failed in their obedience to the will of God and transgressed and were driven from the garden. It was in the garden where the battle commenced again. And the battle was intense, because in the sweat of your brow you shall work all the days of your life. Is it not my will to do the Father's work 24 hours a day, 12 hours a day, Jesus said, in serving and doing the Father's work? He poured out his life work, and it came like great drops of blood, and it poured into the ground, and he prayed with an intensity, and the Father sent an angel there to strengthen him. And he prayed 3 times. And the serpent was crushed in the garden. When Jesus got up from that garden and said, arise and let us go hence, the serpent was dead. He had dealt the blow to the serpent. He had already won the battle. All that remained was to put that serpent on a pole and put him up so that everybody could see he was dead. That's what the crucifixion was. Jesus already won the battle over the serpent in the garden. And the crucifixion was about putting that victory on display, a banner for the world to see that that victory was won. It is so important that when we come to view this fourth saying of Jesus, we see this as a statement of his trust in what God has accomplished. So here's a few things again that leave us with questions around what's on the surface. First thing is, Jesus does not cry, Father, Father. He does not cry, Abba, Abba. Now you might say, well, why is that significant? Every prayer Jesus ever addresses to God that is recorded is always prefaced with the words, Abba, Father. Even the two sayings, the bookends of the sayings on the cross, the first saying and the last saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The last saying, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. Every prayer Jesus ever made was addressed to Abba, his Father. Why in his darkest moment, when he was desperately clinging on, would he use a title, my God, my God? Why wouldn't he say, Father, Father, why have you left me? Doesn't make any sense. In fact, in the garden, when he poured out his heart and soul, he cried, didn't he? Father, if it's possible. That's the battle. That's the intensity of the relationship. Let this cup pass from me. And the Father showed that it's not possible. So, in regards to the Spirit being taken away from Jesus, come with me to John chapter 10 for a minute. John chapter 10 and in verse 18. Verse 17, therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life, that I might take it again. No man takes it from me. I lay it down of myself, and I have power to lay it down. Now, the thing with crucifixion, the art of crucifixion, and the heinous nature of crucifixion was the fact that it was designed to keep people alive as long as possible under the worst suffering. The Romans did not want to see victims die early. They wanted to see them suffer in pain as long as possible. And crucifixion was designed to keep a person alive. When Jesus cried, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And then he gave up the spirit. That was him laying down his life. The Father gave him that gift. The Father, and what a challenge that was. You know, what a challenge it would have been for him. Can you imagine, to be able to let go at any time? But he knew certain things had to happen. He had to endure intense suffering and pain because he knew certain things had to be fulfilled. But the Father gave him power over 12 legions of angels. The Father gave him power to stop that at any time. And it's part of the incredible sacrifice that Jesus had, that he had power over the involuntary things that were happening, or things that ought to have been involuntary to his body. Stephen was full of the Holy Spirit when he looked up to heaven and saw heaven opened as they were stoning him. He was dying as they were stoning him, full of the Holy Spirit. And then he quoted the first and last sayings of Jesus, which we're going to look at again. And he let go. So it doesn't make sense that God had to suddenly take his spirit away. Oops, he's going to die, I need to take it away right now. He had given him this power to lay down his life. But our most important argument that we want to look at in this is Jesus does not use the same phrase or the same Hebrew that is found in Psalm 22. What he says is different to Psalm 22. Now, this is not actually hard to go and find. All you have to do is look at the words Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and go back and look at your Strongs, your eSword. Go and look at Psalm 22 and see how similar Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani is to Psalm 22. And it's actually not very similar at all. It's not just the word sabachthani, which is very different. The whole construct of what Jesus said is not the same. So in the original Aramaic, and this is where we're getting a little bit technical, but in the Peshitta and the old Syriac versions, which have Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, it doesn't add the bit which is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It just says, Jesus cried this. So it's an interpretation of those that have translated this, that have come along and said, it means this. Must do. He must be referring to Psalms. And as I say, I think the reason they've done that is because what Jesus said is quite confusing. And you can actually see it quite obviously, because if Jesus cried, my God, why did they turn around at the cross and say, oh, he's calling for Elijah? You ever thought about that? Isn't my God the most common word that you could have ever used? How could you confuse that? If he was crying, my God, how would you ever confuse that and saying, oh, I think he's calling for Elijah? Wouldn't it have been obvious? There's something in Jesus' statement that is not sounding like Psalm 22. And they didn't hear it as Psalm 22. So here's our quick little exposition before we get into what we're going to make some suggestions right at the end of what Jesus actually said. But to be truthful, I'm not certain. And I think God's made it like that because I think it's the most powerful saying we could ever look at. And God wants us to spend time thinking about it. Because in looking at this and thinking about it, it's had an enormous effect and power in terms of looking at the sacrifice of Jesus for me. So this is the word taken straight out of Psalm 22. It's the Hebrew word orzab, and it means literally to leave something in the sense of neglect, to fail, to forsake, to leave destitute, to refuse something. Has the idea of leaving something behind. And that's why I've never seen the righteous forsaken, begging for bread. That's Psalm 37. Now, that's the same quote there, Psalm 37, verse 25. I've been young and old and have never seen the righteous forsaken, begging for bread. If you look at your Strong's concordance of the word Jesus used, the suggestion is that he's quoting this word sabachthani, which is a Chaldean word found in Chaldean writings like Ezra and Daniel. And it has the idea to leave, but not in the sense of to leave by forsaking. For instance, it's used 3 times of the stump in Daniel. Leave the stump. What does he mean by that? It means preserve the stump. Chop down the tree, but preserve the stump. Save the stump. Don't chop it off. And that's why some of the translations of this verse, taken from the Syrian version, say things like, my God, for this reason have you spared me. For this day have you saved me. For this have you preserved me. Now there's your 5th interpretation of the translation. And that one I'm a whole lot more comfortable with, because that makes a lot more sense. But I actually don't think that's what Jesus said. Because there is, by the way, some have suggested that this word sibach, which is a Chaldean-based word, is just Jesus using like an alternative word to orzab, meaning the same idea, and it's a translation from the Hebrew into a Chaldean equivalent. Problem is, the word orzab translates straight into Chaldean. It's found right through Daniel and Ezra. So the very same word orzab in Psalm 22 is in the Chaldean. Why does he need to change it? So that in itself, just on itself, tells you that Jesus must have been saying something different. Clearly it's not the same word. He chooses a different word. It's not the same. The other suggestion, and I'm not a Hebrew linguist, but I know that there is a very well-known Hebrew linguist in our community, and I haven't really had a full talk to him about this. I hope to talk to him about it, but I understand that he believes this very thing that I'm saying now, but I won't quote it until I've talked to him. But there is some support that I supposedly have from a Hebrew linguist, and that is that the Hebrew word sibach is this word here that Jesus uses, sabachthani, which has the idea of entwine or fold together. And that word is very interesting. But the translators that have come along found that a little bit tricky. My God, why has you entwined me? Why have you folded me together? And so they struggled with that, and they thought the most logical word was the Chaldean word, which means to leave, because of their connection to Psalm 22. But I think Jesus was saying this. I think he was quoting this word, and he's going back to an event in Genesis chapter 22. Because it's the very word in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 13 where Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket. That word for a thicket, a copse of thorns, it means to be held or ensnared. That's the very word sabachthani. And there was Jesus with a crown of thorns on his head, trapped and ensnared. And Jesus takes you straight back to this event of Abraham and Isaac, offering up Isaac, of the ram that's caught in its head by its horns, trapped in a thicket of thorns. Genesis 22 is incredibly interesting when we compare it, particularly to Psalm 22. Because Genesis 22 uses this phrase, take now your son, Isaac, your only son. Abraham, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, and offer him for an offering. This is the Hebrew word yached. It means to be one, your only one. And of the 12 times that it's used in the Old Testament, 10 of them are used of an only child. And this is the first occasion that it's ever used. And it's 3 times that it's found here in Genesis. Genesis 22, verse 2, verse 12, and verse 16. 3 times over and over again, take now thy son, thine only son. Well, guess what? It's in Psalm 22. It's only found 12 times, and it's in Psalm 22. Take now thine only son. In Psalm 22 and verse 20, it says, and perhaps we can just have a look at Psalm 22 as we look at this. And this cry in Psalm 22 where it says in verse 20, deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Verse 21, save me from the lion's mouth, because you have heard me from the horns of the unicorn. That phrase, my darling, there in verse 20, deliver my darling from the power of the dog, is the very same word, yached, thine only one from the power of dog. And hear me from the horns of the unicorn. You know what the reference to the horns of the unicorn was? It was the horns which stood on the brazen altar. In Psalm 118, it says, bind the sacrifice to the horns of the bull, the bullock. Because on the corners of the altar, they had these horns. where they would tether and tie the sacrifices to them, waiting to be sacrificed. And you've got this picture of, he saves me from the lion's mouth. It's like God reaches down and grabs the lamb straight out of the mouth of the lion before it's destroyed. Save me from the horns of the unicorn. There's a sacrifice about to be offered, and God reaches down and saves. And it's echoing, isn't it? The offering of Isaac. Isaac's lying there, tied, about to be sacrificed, and Abraham's about to put the knife into Isaac. And all of a sudden God speaks and saves the sacrifice from the horns of the unicorn, from the horns of the altar. Save my darling. The ram caught in its thicket by the horns. Same idea. The horns of the wild oxen. A reference back to this picture. Psalm 22 and Genesis 22 are very much connected. You have done it. It says in Genesis 22. You have done it, i.e., Abraham sacrificed Isaac. It says that in Hebrews. He so believed that it was as though he'd done it. And because Abraham did it, God says, I will do it. Because you have done it, I will do it. And the finishing words of Psalm 22, the Lord hath done it, i.e., he has given his son. Again, connections. I will multiply your offspring. Back into Psalm 22. All kindreds of the people shall worship you. Your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. Even those destined to death shall be saved. Psalm 22. When you compare Psalm 22 and Genesis 22, and you line them up, they are so connected. And this word yakad is at the heart of it. The deliverance of God's only one. So what's the point? Why do we go back to this connection into Genesis chapter 22? There's an interesting prophecy, and we're not really going to spend too much time on it, but if you've got your Bibles, have a quick look at Amos chapter 8 in verse 2. And here's a prophecy where God tells Amos to go and get a basket of figs, of summer fruit. And Amos goes and gets a basket of summer fruit. Beautiful summer fruits. And he said to Amos, he says, what do you see? And he says, I see this basket of summer fruit. And God said, well, the end has come. It's all over. Why? Because you've seen a basket of summer fruit. One basket of summer fruit and it's the end of the world. Such a strange thing. I see a basket of summer fruit and then God says, the end has come upon my people. I will never again pass by them because you've seen a basket of summer fruit. Well, the first fruits was a picture of when every family would bring the first fruits up to offer them to God. And they would come from all over the land. And parents would come with their children and they'd bring their baskets, and you would see at the time of the first fruit, at the time of the gathering of the summer fruits, you would see these people coming with hundreds of baskets, hundreds of people coming up offering the best, the first fruits of the land. And God is saying to Amos, and he says, what do you see? He says, I see one basket. That's all there is. There's only one basket of summer fruit. The rest is rotten. There's nothing being offered. There's only one basket. And it goes on in Amos to say this in verse 8 and verse 9. On that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon. I'll make the sun go down in the middle of the day, and I will darken the earth in broad daylight. When did that happen? At the cross. And I will turn your feasts into mourning. It was the time of Passover. And I will make your songs lamentation, and I will make it like the mourning for a yakad. Again, I will make it for the mourning like an only son, and the end of it will be a bitter day. Why? Because there's only one basket. And darkness came down upon the land. Now, if you want to see the other connection of the same word, it's in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. I'll pour on the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication, and they will look on me, whom they pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourneth for a yakad. What's our exhortation? We've seen the exposition. What's the exhortation? When we look at the story of Genesis 22 with the offering, Abraham offering of Isaac, we always look at it from the perspective of the father, don't we? We see the sacrifice that Abraham made, the faith that Abraham had, the willingness he had to be able to give in obedience to God his only son. And he was so prepared to do it that he took that boy and did it. It's believed Isaac was about 30 years old. We hardly ever look at the story from Isaac's point of view. Can you imagine this 30-year-old boy being taken by his old man and he's looking around and saying, "Hey, Dad, seem to be missing something. We're going to offer something." And there's no lamb. And Abraham said, "Don't worry, son, God will provide himself a lamb. Just come over here and lie on this rock for a minute while I get these ropes." Isaac would have got it, wouldn't he? He would have seen, and I pretty much tell you what, if that was me, I would have been down that hill and down that mountain like you wouldn't have believed. And there's no way my dad would have been able to catch me, especially not an old man. He could have been trying his best, but he would have never been able to do it. So we look at the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac and we see it from the eyes of the father. But 3 times in the Genesis 22 record it says, "And they went together." And they went together on this journey. And when we look at the crucifixion of Jesus, we see the sacrifice through the eyes of the Son. We see what Jesus is giving, and we often miss the power that this was God giving his only begotten Son. What was the Father doing at this time? How was the Father feeling at this time? God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Imagine his pain and his anguish of having to do this. He wanted to turn away. He would, if it was at all possible that there was another way, he would let this cup pass from his Son. Moses cried and he says, "Lord, show me your glory." And you know what God did? He says, "I'll show you my glory, Moses, because I love you. But you can't see me, and so I'm going to come in darkness." And in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 9 it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud, in darkness, that the people may hear when I speak to you, and that you might believe." And so God came in thick darkness down to speak with Moses. Elijah wanted to see the glory of the Lord, and he had to hide in a cave, in a rock, for the glory of the Lord to pass by them. In our reading in Psalm chapter 18, it says, "And the cords of death compassed me about. The torrents of destruction assailed me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. And in my distress I called upon Yahweh and my God, and I cried for help. And from his temple he heard his voice. My cry came into his ears, and he bowed the heavens and came down. He made thick darkness was under his feet." See, I believe during that 3 hours of darkness, brothers and sisters, God hadn't forsaken Jesus. He was there. He made thick darkness his secret place to come down. Do you know that word for the secret place? The very same phrase here, that he made darkness his secret place, is found in Psalm 31. And we already looked at Psalm 31. It's a psalm of the cross. It's the psalm where the last saying of Jesus come from. "Verily I say unto thee, into thy hands I commit my spirit," verse 5. But in verse 20 of Psalm 31 it says, "You will hide them in the secret of your presence from the pride of men." There was the pride of men around the cross. There were the taunts and the hatred, and all of those that loved Jesus had now gone. They walked away. Mary, John taking Mary and the other woman, and they left him alone. And everybody was around there taunting, and there was just hatred. So what did God do? He bowed the heavens. He bowed the heavens and came down. He made darkness a secret place, and his glory was right there at the cross. And he was with his Son. He was there with him, because it was the Father and Son going together. This was his sacrifice. Jesus didn't cry, my God, why have you left me? Why have you forsaken me? He was crying out to the people that they might draw their attention back to Genesis 22. He cried, this is the ram, it's caught in the thicket. God hasn't forsaken me, God's here, He's giving me. It's the most beautiful picture of the work of the atonement, of the Father and Son going together. Abraham, of course, would name the place Yahweh Yireh. That is to say, in the mount of Yahweh it shall be seen. And of course, Jesus would say of them, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. In fact, he says, of course, before Abraham was, I am, which perhaps is a little key with the fact that Abraham turned and looked behind him. Because before Abraham was, I am, he looked behind him and he saw the ram caught in the thicket. Because Jesus was the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, the lamb that the Father had prepared right from the start. And of course, the ultimate verses that are used in that reading in Genesis 22, in blessing I will bless thee, and your seed will possess the gate of his enemies. And in Revelation it says, I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, am I alive forevermore, and I have the keys to hell and death. So, as we finish and as we come to partake of bread and wine, I'm not sure what Jesus cried from the cross. I know he didn't cry, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I know the original, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, might allude to Psalm 22, but it's not a quote of Psalm 22. It's definitely an allusion back to Genesis 22. There's a real key to that. In the original, again in the Peshitta, the word my God, Eli, Eli, is not used. It's the word Ail. And in the Aramaic, which is believed what Jesus would have spoken, the original Peshitta has Ail, lama sabachthani. Ail is a word which is the Hebrew root of the word for Ale, for God. It means power and strength. It has the idea of, like power and strength of an ox or of an oak tree. But its most common usage in the whole of the Bible is the word for ram. And as to say, I'm not a Hebrew linguist, but it actually sounds, the beginning part of Ail sounds closer when you say Elijah than what Ale does. And maybe that's why they heard and they said, oh, he's calling for Elijah. Because in the original, Ail, lama sabachthani was his cry. And I'm going to suggest to you that what Jesus cried from the cross was the ram. The ram. In the thicket. And it answered all the taunts that were there. God's forsaken him? No. This is the Father and Son. This is the lambs that God has prepared, slain from the foundation of the world. It's a difficult saying, but I believe that saying is the most incredible statement of trust that we will ever find. And I think it has such power for us as we come to partake of bread and wine, to see this relationship that Jesus had with his Father, that Jesus rose above all the pain and all the anguish that was there on the cross. And he had this incredible intimate experience with his Father there. And he made this cry from the cross for us to see and to know that this is what God has done. He has not withheld his beloved, his Yakad, his only Son, that you and I might have life.